Welcome back to the Guillemot Kayaks Workshop. I'm Nick Schade. It's been a while since I've actually been working on the boat. I've been working on the display stand for the boat, and most of the time I've put the boat outside to cook the epoxy a little bit. By getting the epoxy good and hot, it drives the cure cycle farther along and makes it so the epoxy is harder and stronger. So at this point, I'm hopefully ready to do the final sanding. So that's what this episode's going to be about, is that final sanding. I will start by cleaning the boat because it's been outside. There's dust, there's bird poop, there's all sorts of crud on it. I've actually put the boat in the water a little bit just to do a test before I do the final finishing. And so there's crud on it. So first thing I want to do is make sure it's good and clean. So when I do the sanding, I'm not just wiping that crud around the boat and driving it into the scratches of the sanding. So first process will be wash it down. I'll use a Scotch-Brite for that to scrub it a little bit. I've got a little bit of ammonia in that water to just give it something to help clean with. And then I'll go over the boat, look for high spots that I can knock off with a file or a rasp. Then I'll go over it with a fairly coarse grit and start working to finer and finer grits. I could stop at 220. That's probably fine enough for doing the finish work. So that's what we're doing today. Let's get started. So after cleaning it off with the water and ammonia, I'm drying it off so any contaminants that have been picked up by that water and ammonia come off in the rag instead of just having it dry again on the boat and not remove the contaminants. So should be good and clean now, and I can start on the next step. So I'm now going to go over and look for drips and large spots that I can knock down quickly. If I were to take this drip right here and try and sand it down, you see how, I am knocking the top off of this drip, but I'm also sanding all the way around it. And I end up sanding around here just about as quick as I sand the top of the drip off. So this isn't really an effective way of getting rid of that drip. Where if I take a rasp, that drip is now gone. Yeah, I've made a couple scratches into the surface of the boat, but I'm going to be doing some heavy sanding later anyways. But I'm really only taking the high spot off, and this is a coarse side of a 4-in-hand rasp. Similarly, I could use Shinto wood rasp. Basically, I just lay it on the surface. And it's very effective at knocking down the high material in that drip. This is a Japanese float plane. Again, knocks that right down really quickly. And now if I go ahead and sand it, that drip just doesn't appear anymore. So instead of trying to knock these drips down with sandpaper, I go ahead and clean everything up with a rasp of some sort. Likewise, remember the last fill coat I put on, I had the part line right here at the center line, so I've got a little bit of a ridge there. Can blend that all in quickly with a hard, stiff tool like this, where it's not going to wrap around down to the material on either side. It's just going to knock the high spot off and really won't attack the material around it until the high spot is knocked down and level with the surface around it. The thing I like about these Japanese rasps is the teeth are like little plane blades. They're not a sharp, pointy tooth. They're like an edge tool. As a consequence, when I'm doing this work, it's unlikely I'm going to get a deep gouge anywhere because I don't have that single point that wants to dig deeply into the surface. So one of the other reasons I put the boat out in the sun to cook is because the process of putting it out in the sun will actually soften the epoxy while it's hot. Anytime the boat is hot, the epoxy is a little bit softer. What that means in the context of what I'm trying to do here is if there's any stress in the layup of the boat, the softened epoxy of when it's hot will tend to relieve that stress. When that stress is relieved in the fiberglass, it tends to cause a little bit of delamination. So if you look right here, you can start to see some of that weave showing through, the weave texture right there. What's happened here is there's some sort of stress in the boat, and it looks like it's due to the grain of this wood. There's sort of a squirrely bit of grain right in here, and this pattern repeats down here where that same grain pattern exists. It's slightly noticeable in some other spots. And remember, on the back deck here, I slip matched these strips, and so this is a repeating pattern from here to up here. I'm looking at each of these spots, and it's only this slight stress characteristic right here only shows up in a couple of these spots, but it's consistently where this grain pattern exists. Well, from a practical standpoint, there's really not a problem here. This boat's still strong, but visually we're getting this little pattern in here, which I'd like to get rid of. I'm trying to make a nice boat for my customer here, and we at least want to start with it looking pretty unblemished. So what I want to do here is sand away the glass here to the point where this texture disappears. I don't want to sand into the stain if I can help it, but if I can sand into this glass and get that texture to disappear, and then put some new glass over top of it and new epoxy and get that all sanded smooth, that'll make that blemish go away. And this is one of those things where I'm always reluctant to do this. It seems like a big deal to start sanding way into the boat, but as a practical matter, I find whenever I do it, oh, that wasn't such a big deal. Just go ahead and do it, get it over with, and move on. So I'm going to take my detail sander here and work on that area. Work slowly. I've got fairly fine grit sandpaper here. This is 100 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to work into that area, making a little low spot here, but we'll come back and fill that in with some new glass and epoxy later, and it'll all level out. You see how all this dust appeared? Didn't have my vacuum turned on in the right mode to turn on the vacuum and collect that dust. Notice when I turn this back on, the vacuum comes on, and when I sand, it doesn't make that dust. I'm going to wet this area down with some denatured alcohol so I can see what's going on here. So I'm still not into it. Alright, we're starting to see the texture of the cloth, so I've sanded through the fill coats where I get the smooth gray. Now I'm starting to sand into the glass itself, so you're starting to see a little bit of that weave texture right there. By cleaning it off, I can continually see that whether or not I'm actually attacking the right spot. So we want to get in there and down in there more. I'm trying to be very careful here because there's a fine line between getting into the glass and sanding all the way through the epoxy. There's a spot right here where I'm just through the glass and into the epoxy above the wood, but almost going to grind into the wood itself. And again, I want to try and avoid that so I don't have to replace the stain there. So I'm going to try and avoid hitting that spot right in there and work on these spots on either side. All right, that weave texture is starting to fade there. And I'm just hitting the wood. So as it's drying out, you can see that I'm through the stain a little bit right there and just touching the stain right in there. I could probably get away without doing anything to this, as this is a dark spot already and it'll just fade into the natural grain of the wood. Well, let's just, for the fun of it, go ahead and touch it up with some stain. All right, that'll fade in quite nicely. Anytime you're doing a touch-up like this, it's a balancing act between doing something that may make more visible damage versus trying to get rid of something that's already there. You got to decide when it's worth doing and when it's not. I think this place is borderline. You know, there's a little bit of weave showing here and here. I could probably get away with just leaving that as is. But I think this one will look better if I go ahead and do the same process. All right, so that's pretty much gone there. So we'll put glass on these two spots. I'm going to use a fast cure epoxy so I can keep on moving. And I'm going to use 2-ounce cloth on that, so it's a thinner cloth. And I'll layer it a little bit, biggest piece on the bottom, then smaller piece over where I've sanded away all the glass, and then that will get sanded flush and smooth. So I'll make, like I say, 2 layers here, and I'll make one patch the size of the sanded area. And then I'll make the next one the size of the area where I've removed all the glass. And I'm using the 2-ounce cloth just because it'll blend in more easily. Something like that. So I've mixed up some fast cure epoxy here, so it's just a regular epoxy, but instead of the standard hardener, I'm using the fast hardener. So I warmed up the spot just to help the wet out a bit. Apply some epoxy to the area. So that should blend in nicely. All right, I took a break for lunch. These are still a little tacky. I'll let those set up some more while I flip the boat over and work on sanding the bottom of the boat. Here I've got a brush bristle embedded in the epoxy. It's in sort of a wider open surface here, hard to hit with the rasp. So I'm just going to take a scraper and flat gone. You can see how the epoxy, as it was flowing when it was wet, that little hair acted as a dam and created a little bit of a sag next to it, but that'll all bear out when we're done. So I'm going to start this sanding process with 80 grit sandpaper on my longboard. And again, I'm starting out with fairing. The goal here is to try and get rid of small irregularities in the surface contour to make it a nice smooth curve without sudden small changes in the curvature. And if I started out with a random orbital sander, that pretty much conforms to the shape. And this is really like what I was doing with the rasps. I'm just trying to use something fairly stiff. So I want the sander to just hit the high spots, sanding away at those, passing directly over the low spots, leaving them untouched until I've ground the high spots down to the level of the low spots. So here I've got an area that's sanding out quite nicely, but there's a couple little low spots here that are still shiny now after doing a fair amount of sanding. So at this point you could say, okay, I'm just going to wait and go over this with the random orbital, and at that time I'll probably end up sanding through that and it'll, you know, disappear. But you might end up with a little bit of a ripple there, just because the random orbital will tend to conform to that a little bit better, and by getting rid of the gloss, it might be going in just slightly into that surface and creating a little bit of a ripple. I have reason to believe the fill coat here is plenty thick enough. When I sanded this before putting this last fill coat on, I really wasn't sanding into the glass anywhere. So there's some new fill coat on top of that because this is shiny, so it's covered over that initial sanding. And so all I'm doing right now is sanding into the new fill coat. I've got plenty of material there. So if I go ahead and keep on sanding this down until this disappears, I'll have a nice fair surface there, and I'll still have enough epoxy left over that I can sand the scratches out of that. So at this point, I'm just going to keep on sanding this a little bit more. If I run my fingers over this, I just barely feel any low spot there. The deepest is right in there. I can just barely feel something. You know, I feel a little bit of a change in height there as I run my finger over it, but barely anything there. So I can certainly keep on sanding this and know I'll have a really nice fair surface there. Up in the ends, we have the places where I had more glass. So here's you can see here is the tape that goes around the stem. And then here's the glass that wrapped over from the hull onto the deck. And then here is the edge of that original fill coat that covered over that transition. And these are very slight changes in sort of elevation and height there. And if I just came over this with the random orbital sander again, it wouldn't do anything to eliminate those. And now, do you need to eliminate them? Absolutely not. The boat's going to work fine if you keep those very slight transitions in there and just sand this nice and smooth, and it'll look awesome. But I'm just trying to get a really fair surface, and this only really shows up in the reflection off the boat when you've got a good gloss finish on it and you see something straight in the reflection. This will make a nice fair smooth curve of that reflection. And again, how important is this? It's not important at all. But if we're trying to make a really fair surface, that's how we do it. This longboard, again, it bridges over the low spots and sands away the high spots. So it's going to be more aggressive along the edges and take a little bit longer to get into these places sort of next to those edges. But that's what we're trying for here, is to make that a nice smooth surface without any minor irregularities. Again, if I run my hand over this, I don't feel a thing. So this isn't something you can tell is there just by feeling it or just by looking at it in a normal situation. It sort of only shows up in obscure conditions. But even if you don't have that reference of a nice, like again, sort of a fluorescent tube reflected in the side of the boat, which makes a nice straight line, it is something that is very subtly noticeable when you have a nice fair surface with a nice gloss finish over it. Everything reflected in that just comes out smoother and nicer. You know, it's again a subtle thing, but it is a noticeable thing if you're really looking for it. So I'm just going to spend some time here trying to blend this all in, and I could get this scratched up really quickly by breaking out the random orbital and just going over this, and that would actually do some to level this out and be good, but it's easier with the longboard and quicker with the longboard and produces a better result. All right, that's pretty good. I still have a slight shiny spot right there and a slight shiny spot right there, one right up in there, but that's really sort of negligible at this point. I get scratches through those shiny spots, so they're very close to the same level. And again, I've got to go over the whole thing with finer grits to get rid of the scratches, so when that's all done, that should be in good shape. So the initial sanding I just did was on the bottom. As you notice, I did not actually go past the chine. Up at the bow, the chine's less noticeable, and I'll start working below that. But I want to keep it glossy on this chine basically until the very end. I will start to make that narrower and narrower, that glossy spot a little bit narrower, but I don't want to actually use the 80 grit sandpaper on the chine itself. I want to keep that as sharp and as thick as possible. That is somewhat of an exposed spot there. When you hit rocks or something, that's going to take a fairly hard hit right there. So I want to make sure I'm not sanding into the glass, and I want to leave a good thick coat of epoxy there just to have some armor. So I just put in a new piece of sandpaper on my fairing sander, and now I'll work on the sides. So you see where I was working on sanding this down to get rid of this little shiny spot there. I did sand into the glass. You can see the glass texture here a little bit. And from the looks of it, the texture starts here, then fades away here, and there's no glass texture in there. Actually, I see a little bit right in the middle. So I've sanded all the way through the glass, the outer layer of glass, in this section in order to fair this out. I'm not concerned about it because, as you remember, I've got 2 layers of glass on the bottom here. And so from the part line, which is right here, on up, there's 2 layers of glass, at least. I also have a 3rd layer running up like this and over like that, just along the keel and around the stem. So I've really got quite a bit of glass there. And you know, as far as where I need the armor of extra glass, this isn't a spot right here where it's going to get hit or run aground or whatever. It's going to hit right here and wear through right there. And any hard hit is going to be in that section. I'm not worried that there's a little less glass down here in this area. It's okay. So in the interest of making it fair, and so I get a nice reflection off of that, I'm willing to sand into that glass to make a nice fair surface. And again, on the chine here, I've left it shiny. I've sanded up to it on either side, but I'm leaving it shiny, and I'll sort of keep on making that shiny spot narrower and narrower with each successive higher grit of sandpaper, and then at the very end I'll come by and hand sand that to round it over and give it a little bit of a radius. but I want to keep as much material there as I can. I just need to get it fair. So one side's completely faired out. I haven't really touched the other side. I'm going to do that now. And the thing to remember about the fairing sanding is this is the hardest sanding of this stage of the process. After I get it all leveled out and fair, I can come back with the random orbital and quickly, essentially, this is the sanding that matters. Everything else after this is just getting rid of the scratches from this sanding. So I'm using as coarse a grit as I can to move quickly, but I'm using as fine a grit as I can to make as small scratches as possible. And so it's a balancing act. If I had a really rough surface here, I'd go with the coarser sandpaper. This is 80 grit. I have some 60 grit of this now, and I step up to the 60 grit and go to it with the 60 grit. If I felt that it was really smooth after the fill coat and I didn't have a lot of drips or sags or anything, I might say, oh, I'll start out with 100, 120 grit. At this point, I think 80 grit's a good compromise. It's moving quickly. The scratches, there are obviously scratches. I'll go directly to 100 grit with the random orbital. That'll help get rid of the 80 grit scratches. And then from there, I'll go to 120 or 150 and then up to 220. We'll see how it goes. I'm just going to end up doing the bottom of this. We'll see how far I get. If I can flip it over, I'll work on the deck some. I'm going to go paddling around 4 o'clock. It's 2 o'clock now. See how much we can do before it's time to leave. All right, that took me 40 minutes, something like that, to pretty much sand 1/2 of the bottom. And this is what it should look like, a nice uniform surface, even scratches over the whole thing, and sort of a uniform tone where you've sanded everything the same amount. The low spots will tend to look slightly darker until you get them sanded to the same level. But this is looking good. It's fairing out nicely. Didn't take a lot of work to get it to this point. I'm dripping with sweat. I said before, fairing is a whole boat process, and that means covering a lot of area at a time, and that takes some energy if you're doing it with a longboard like this. We're just trying to cover a lot of area and working somewhat aggressively, and I'm dripping with sweat. Now I'm ready to work on sanding the deck. The little patch back there is about hard now. I'll sort of get to that last, see what it's like when I get there, see how long it takes me to get there. But again, we're trying to make a nice, smooth, fair surface here. You can already see we've got a highlight right here reflecting off a fluorescent light. So that's starting out as a straight line. And you see it's a nice, fair, smooth curve following the shape of the boat. So, that's kind of what we want. As this gets shinier, the width of that highlight gets narrower and it becomes more distinct. Here I've gone over this once with a Scotch-Brite pad, so that has dulled the surface a little bit and spread that highlight out. But we're going to work on sanding this down and try and make it really nice and fair, so if we get this in the right light and we see that reflection, we get a nice, straight, smooth curve on that reflection. It just barely shows here, but you can still see it a little bit. Back before I did the fill coat and the sanding for the fill coat, I pointed out there were some spots every 10 inches where it wasn't getting sanded as quickly as the spots in between. And I don't know how well this shows up in the video, but you can see it's a little bit darker right here, right there, and right there. Again, that is where the forms used to be. And so when I was doing the initial fairing sanding back when this was raw wood, before staining, before doing anything, the forms supported the strips ever so slightly. You know, the strips are stiff and the forms are fairly close together, but in between the forms, the boat was a little bit more flexible. So when I pushed to sand or plane or whatever I was doing, even if I'm using a very light touch, the surface of the boat would flex away a little bit more between the forms than it would at the forms. With the result being, I sanded slightly more at the forms than I did between the forms. And that shows up still as being a place where this is a little low. As I run over it with the fairing sander, it's a little bit more likely to hit here and here than it is to hit here, here, and here. So I'm still at this point making the boat more fair. That's part of the reason for using this longboard. Again, very, very minor thing. Probably not worth worrying about. If you're going to put a lot of deck lines on the boat, you're never going to see any of this. Just something to be aware of, something to think about, and don't worry about it if you don't want to. So at this angle, you can see the reflection of, I guess it's my garage door supports or something on the garage door supports. This line right here. And you see it's got a little bit of a wiggle to it. Some of that is just the brush strokes from applying the fill coat. Some of it is still the little bit of waviness caused by the forms. But that's what we're trying to get, a nice straight, and well, not straight, but fair, smooth curve on that. Get that reflection so it doesn't wiggle back and forth as it goes. So this episode's dragging out. I'm going to cut it off here. I have some more fairing to do, and after that I need to sand out the scratches. So I'm just going to split this episode right here, then I'll start up the next episode with the rest of the fairing and continue on with the sanding. It's not like I've done all that much with this episode so far, but it seems like I've had a lot to say. So that's what takes up the time. I can time lapse through boring sanding stuff, but when I decide to talk, that's when things drag out. So without further ado, if you liked this episode and learned anything, give me a thumbs up. If you're enjoying this whole series, hit subscribe. There's still more coming. And if you want to support the production of more videos like this, please head over to Patreon and chip in a little bit. These videos take a lot of time to produce. It seems like I haven't produced a lot of videos recently, but I've been making a lot of video while I'm working on the boat. At this stage in the building process, I'm really trying to get the boat done. I've got a customer waiting for this. I haven't been producing the videos, I've just been taking video as I'm working, and it's accumulating, and hopefully once I'm got the boat out the door, I'll be able to edit all that stuff down and get it out to you so you can see the whole process. So once again, your support on Patreon is really appreciated. Thanks again, and thanks for watching, and happy paddling.